clear of the closing doors, please.
Welcome to Subway Sports Talk. My name is Peter Kennedy, and I am your host. Thank you so much, as always, for tuning in to SST on Apple Podcasts app, Spotify, and on YouTube. Don't forget, you can watch the podcast on Spotify as well as on YouTube, of course, right? You can always watch stuff on YouTube, but we also have a great guest here today. He's been on the podcast before. Last time we had him on was preseason to the NFL season, because he is not just good at the thing that we're about to talk about. I like to call him the fantasy god. Donald Wagenblast, host of the Collections podcast on Spotify. Find it on collection.blog.com. There we go. Donald, what's up, brother?
Hey, man. Thank you so much for having me, Pete. It's great to see you, especially before the holidays. Glad we got to squeeze this in. I'm happy to report that your nicknaming of guru or god or whatever of fantasy is. I think I did you proud this season. It's been a very interesting season to navigate in terms of fantasy football, and happy to say that I've got a couple of teams that I really believe are championship worthy. So excited to get into kind of how that all played out this year. But how's your teams doing, man? What's the vibe here?
Yeah, I, like you, am in 6 leagues, so way too many for starters. But
Sure.
2 playoffs out of 6, which is respectable.
Yep.
Not great, not what I wanted. I feel like I had 3.5 playoff worthy teams. One team especially felt playoff worthy, just did not have the ball bounce in my favor, multiple 1-point losses in the midst of the season there. So that stung a little bit. That team felt really good. But 2 playoffs, you really only have to win 1. When you're in multiple leagues, you win 1, you feel like you at least played for free. If not, if it was a big league, maybe you come out on top. Who's to say?
Yeah.
I'm feeling pretty good myself. And depends on who you talk to out of my friend groups. One friend group might be like, nah, he sucked. He had like the second least points. And the other group might be like, no, he's in the playoffs again. That's what he does, right? So, that's fantasy football, baby. That's why we love it.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's been a crazy year. I think, a lot of that is just because, I mean, I've talked about this with like anybody who'd listen. Like, the NFL has had a down year, period. You can't look at the way that this landscape is shaping out. Even just like, we're recording this on Tuesday, December 12th. It's going to be released the day after. Like last night, Miami loses at home to the Tennessee Titans, who hadn't won a road game all year. And, they literally had a touchdown given to them by Will Levis. The bad pitch when they had just gone up 7. I mean, when you're supposed to be the 1 seed in the league, and or at least in the AFC, and you're just like letting up a 15-point comeback in the last 2 minutes and 40 seconds of a game, something's just wrong here. And, some of that does end up bleeding into fantasy. And I know a lot of people, myself and my brother included, who I used to do Run Up the Score with, like, we very much benefited from the craziness of that Dolphins game, and even a little bit the craziness of the Giants and Packers game. I don't want to overshadow Tommy Cutlets, because I mean, it's been what a fun story that's been from a noted Giant hater like myself. Even I'm my heart grew like the Grinch's. Yeah, man. Listen, Jersey takes care of its own forever. And, so I love Tommy Cutlets. I think that cartoon character of an agent that he had is really fun.
Amazing.
I honestly think that like Tommy DeVito's family was just like created by Sebastian Maniscalco. Like, they're just like the embodiment of a Sebastian Maniscalco stand-up bit. And I'm cool with that too. I mean, it's awesome. And Jersey forever, I guess, is how I'll wrap that up.
I'm super here for it. Anytime chicken cutlets get more pub, I'm for it, because you know what? So in a weird way, there's portions of your life in which chicken cutlets get slept on, right? Because you go to a restaurant and you're like, I'm not going to order a chicken cutlet. I grew up having chicken cutlets every week. Why would I order at the restaurant? But sometimes, no matter where you are, no matter who you are, a chicken cutlet's going to do you right. Tommy Cutlets has been doing us right.
Yeah.
And what we're going to do here in a minute too, to segue quickly, we got Donald Wagenblast, host of the Collections podcast, former host of Run Up the Score podcast, Fantasy God, as I said.
Thank you.
He's going to tell you how to win your fantasy league in the playoffs, because it's not over yet. Your strategy's no pressure, right? Your strategy's not over yet. But can I just ask you quickly about the Giants before we get into the specifics of all the fantasy stuff here? When you hear, as a known Giants hater like yourself, but a guy who's kind of rooting for the excitement of football in the tri-state, perhaps, right?
Yeah.
When you hear people talking about the Giants as a team that could even remotely think about making a playoff run, do you laugh your ass off, or do you enjoy it and think it's possibly possible?
No, and as a matter of fact, like I'm even like kind of walking back my Giants hate that went into this season because like one of the reasons that the NFL is down this year is because of quarterback injuries, and that goes right into Daniel Jones as well. Like, you know, he was starting to put it together a little bit. I know the Giants' schedule was brutal in the middle of the season. That's why their loss column ballooned up to 8. And, you know, and obviously he got hurt, which is going to be a really interesting offseason for them now that Tommy DeVito is potentially playing them out of a top 5 pick in a draft that's probably going to have 3 quarterbacks taken in the top 5. So it's just they've been a very interesting team to follow. The one thing that I don't doubt and have not doubted all year, even while the Giants were struggling, is like, I think you got to have the right GM, the right coach, and the right quarterback in place if you're going to win a championship in the NFL. I typically never know anything about the GM. I just assume that they're at least some sort of an extension of the coach. I do think the Giants have the right coach. I think Dable is awesome. When you see him get fired up for Tommy, you know, that's going, I think, overlooked a little bit is like how Dable is adjusting his offense to Tommy DeVito's skill set and just kind of like setting him up for, you know, more success. Obviously, like Jalen Hyatt and Wan'Dale Robinson both getting healthy and coming on at the end of the year has been a really big bright spot. And, you know, Saquon's making himself money. I don't know that the Giants are going to pay it to him this offseason, but he's definitely earned himself some money. And so it's been cool to watch the Giants over the past few weeks. You know, the Tommy DeVito thing, like he's not going to outplay Patrick Mahomes for a half of a season. So like the whole like, oh my God, he's got more touchdowns and fewer interceptions than Mahomes over the last 3 weeks. Like over the course of his career, I don't think that that's going to be the case unless I'm wrong. You know, like at this time last year, so. And this was the thing that really messed me up today when I was thinking about like how we were going to approach today's episode is like, you know, around this time last year, we were like, Brock Purdy's not going to be around next year. So what does it really matter that he's playing really well? So now I'm like, Are we doing this again? But this time it's the Giants. And this time it's like, you know, I get to talk to my dad and he's happy about being a Giants fan now. Like, I hope that that's the case because, and even if it's not, like the Giants have a lot of really interesting questions to answer this offseason. And one of the things I'm going to do on the blog, collectionsblog.com, for those who didn't hear Pete's first plug, appreciate the plug as always, Pete. But collectionsblog.com, like for the teams that don't make the playoffs, and obviously the Giants are very much potentially going to make the playoffs given, you know, the carnage in front of them and around them. But like the hope index is going to be something that I'm considering is like, how much hope is there? How much intrigue is there into what the team's decisions are going to be in the offseason? And the Giants are going to be towards the top of that list in terms of both hope and in terms of intrigue, because there's a lot of different ways that they can go. And, you know, they've got a lot of good skill position players who are trending up. I think they nailed the Hyatt pick, even though he hasn't really been utilized in a way that, you know, you'd hope to see a rookie wide receiver who's taken that high look. Wan'Dale Robinson getting healthy, made the huge catch against the Packers. So, you know, this is the most I've talked about the Giants with anyone in the last 21 months. So that's got to mean that it's a good time to be a Giants fan, right?
You were prepared just by being a football fan, which means that they're at least bringing intrigue. Obviously you're local as well, but they're bringing intrigue to the table here. And I think what was really underlying in that game last night, because a lot of talk about Jordan Love going into the game, how young the Packers offense is, the sneaky graphic that went in there towards the end of the game, after you saw the Packers having the youngest offense in the league, you saw the Giants have the youngest defense in the league with their starters, the youngest defense in the entire league. And that defense has played well this year. There's been a lot of games where they've kept them in them. Of course, they've gotten run out of the gym by a few teams. I think maybe like 3 or 4 times. You've looked at the schedule. There was 3 or 4 times their defense got lit up. But mostly that defense has been playing very well, which adds to that intrigue. It adds to the decision-making that will go into next year and maybe doubling down on offense, doubling down on Daniel Jones or Tommy DeVito. The Brock Purdy thing makes it super interesting as well. I haven't thought about his name when it comes to Tommy D. And maybe that's just because the Niners are such a juggernaut that we thought of it as like, yeah, well, they're going to find someone better than Brock Purdy. Well, the Giants aren't a juggernaut. We don't think that there's a team around Tommy DeVito to carry him, but that doesn't mean that Tommy DeVito can't continue to play at a level where he's at minimum competing with a post-ACL Daniel Jones, which is very much a real possibility. I don't know if it's a situation we should want as fans, but the way it's trending right now, this area is going all in on Tommy DeVito. I guess we'll see where that takes us. I've been saying it, though, for weeks now. If you look back maybe 6-7 weeks ago on this podcast, like, you know what? It's been super disappointing. And I'm not saying they're going to flip the script and be great, but the way this schedule works out, the way they've been playing, this team could still mess around and get to 7-8 wins. And now we're here. It's in fruition. And you look back at that Bills loss, which was brutal, the Jets loss, which was brutal, a couple other games here and there. And, you know, this is one of those seasons that they're still not a Super Bowl contender. They're not a juggernaut in the NFC, but they're like 4 or 5 plays away from having 2 to 3 more wins. And that's no joke, but that's how football goes every year. Last year they made it in. This year they're on their they're looking up at it. So I guess we'll see if they could pull off the impossible moving forward.
Especially with Philly 2 out of the last 3 weeks of the season as their last 3 games. Like, that's going to be difficult, especially because, you know, Philly's starting to get more and more desperate, but that also could just mean that they're starting to get more and more vulnerable as well. And so that, you know, the Giants have a really unique opportunity to either spoil somebody's playoff seeding or playoff dreams, or potentially play themselves into a spot. And either way, I think the Giants are going to end with more hype going into next season than we thought they would have had around week 8 or so. And that's, you know, at this point in the season, that's all you can hope for. I'm a Los Angeles Chargers fan. Your hope as Giants fans is way better than mine right now.
Yep.
And it's probably going to stay that way, especially if Brandon Staley is the coach going into the 2024 season.
That would be really unfortunate if that was true. That would be painful.
Yeah, say a prayer.
And also, your quarterback's out for the year. So
honestly, like, that's good. I'm glad that they opted for surgery, because and by the way, like, you know, the Justin Herbert fraud discussion, I understand, got a little louder this year because it started last year with the playoff collapse, and I get it. Like, it's been tough, but man, I mean, if you're playing in spite of your coach the way that he's been, like, I don't even, and, you know, it's been a tough year for Kellen Moore too, because he was supposed to come in and be this, you know, this ascending offensive coordinator. And how did the Cowboys let him out of the building? Well, look what the Cowboys are doing without him. And, you know, for fantasy purposes, like, Herbert was a top 5 quarterback throughout the entire season before he got hurt. He only ended up getting like 2 points last week. But if you take that out and do his points per game average, his is right up there with the tops in the league. And, you know, his rushing numbers were up, which I had alluded to when I was talking to you about this in the preview. Like, you know, his rushing numbers are going to go up because he wasn't playing with fractured ribs. Now, obviously, like, he's going to miss, you know, the playoffs, even though, you know, for a lot of teams, he was probably a pretty consistent force. If you were to take him, I think he was going in like the 4th or 5th round this year. So
I had him in one league, and I'll tell you what, he was not the problem.
No,
he may have not been my hero, but he was not the problem. I'm not in the playoffs in that league. So,
and I think that's the same. It's funny. Like, that's the same point with the Chargers. Like, Herbert's not the problem, but he's not overcoming the other problems either.
Listen,
and that's where we're at with him.
Any Justin Herbert fraud talk from me. You may hear it on this podcast, just not from me.
Yeah, well, and I honestly don't have a great answer against it either. Like, you know, it would be nice to get a playoff win and, you know, or at least, you know, challenge in the division. Like, they're going to get smoked by Las Vegas on Thursday.
Here's the answer when you want to talk about it. When you, me, anyone who watches football, as much as we all say we watch football, when you watch somebody play quarterback, he is a top impressive quarterback every single time. Yeah. You cannot watch a Justin Herbert game and just point out 4 plays where he wasn't perfect, because he's perfect every other time. So a lot of the stats check out for him. All the stuff is great. So any nerd culture people, they can find a way to argue for Justin Herbert. And if you're watching him and eye test think he's trash, I don't know what you're watching. I've seen games where he's played quote unquote bad games and been like, God, I love that guy. He's so good. Yeah. So I don't know who these people are. They're just haters. They want to be haters, and we'll let them hate.
All right, good. Because, you know,
let's talk about some fantasy football.
Yeah, let's go. I could go on. I love Justin. I would take a bullet for Justin Herbert. So I could go on.
I've been defending him.
So I appreciate it. It's good to have you in the Turbo Herbo Hive.
Yeah, I was having conversations about this over and over again, because it's infuriating watching Quentin Johnston just drop passes that would win games, and then Herbert gets blamed, and his defense is the worst against the whatever. I digress.
All right, can I say one more thing? Can I just say one more thing? Herbert, as far as I know, has never and will never react to a blown call the way Mahomes did at the end of the Bills game. I'm done. That's it.
Okay. I don't know how much that helps your argument, but I'll take it. I'll allow it.
Well, a lot of people flaming Mahomes right now, so
that's fair. That's very fair.
Yeah.
And the Chiefs are obviously trash now, so that's what it is. I'm being sarcastic, but, you know, that's what it is today, at least after week 14.
Yeah.
You know, So are the Eagles, and the Cowboys are the best team in the league. All right, we move on. Fantasy football.
Yeah.
Donald Wagenblast,
Yes. Let's ride.
collectionsblog.com, the collections podcast on Spotify. So
Spotify
I want to start off with
exclusive.
this
We just renewed.
Spotify exclusive, of course. I want to start off with something simple here.
Yeah.
I want to ask you, for the regular season, before we get into the playoff stuff, for the regular season, Donald, who has been your fantasy football MVP?
So it's a simple question, right? The answer to that is not so simple. And this was something that on my old fantasy football podcast, Run Up the Score, that I did with my brother Scott and our good friend Tom Hillier, like the three of us constantly went back and forth on what it means to be the fantasy football MVP. And I actually was lucky enough to have dinner with Scott before we recorded so that I could pick his brain a little bit on this. And he and I had each said two names and they were entirely different. So my choices were Christian McCaffrey and Tyreek Hill. And they were both chosen for the same reason, right? They were perennial first round picks who were not going outside of the first round this year. And the first round of fantasy football drafts was a minefield this year, right? You've got Justin Jefferson, who through no fault of his own missed a lot of time, got hurt. Like I stand behind what I said when I was on your preview. Like if you have half point PPR or full point PPR settings in your league, I'm totally okay with you going Justin Jefferson number one overall. He just presents such a weekly advantage. And he was one of like four receivers who gained 100 yards in every game he started and finished this year. So like that's a huge advantage at wide receiver, particularly because he was catching 7 or 8 passes a game at least. And, you know, they were keeping him involved. Kevin O'Connell, like one of the more underrated coaches, I think, in terms of scheming for his guys. So, but, you know, McCaffrey was going to. Jamar Chase has not been that answer to the wide receiver one conversation around who can challenge Justin Jefferson for the throne. That just didn't happen with Jamar Chase this year. Didn't happen with Cooper Kupp. He also got hurt, no fault of his own. Austin Eckler has been in and out of the lineup and in and out of fantasy lineups at this point in the year. He's been horrible, hasn't scored anywhere near the amount of touchdowns he scored over the last couple of years. So as I'm rolling through this, like the first round was not good this year for fantasy football, but there were two guys that you can count on and you can say, okay, I picked him in the first round and my team's and your team's probably in the playoffs because of it. Tyreek Hill, who is the number one wide receiver, even with a subpar by his standards game. He had 8 points, half PPR, and played like less than half the snaps against the Titans on Monday night. And Christian McCaffrey. In my notes, I wrote down in half point PPR settings, CMC is the RB1. He's over the number 2 running back, Raheem Mostert, by 59 points. Tyreek Hill in half point PPR is wide receiver 1. He's 39 points ahead of wide receiver 2. That's what you got in the first round. That's huge. Now, the other option of that, and what you're saying is the fantasy football MVP. Well, let's talk about the guys right below Christian McCaffrey and right below Tyreek Hill. Raheem Mostert is running back 2. You could have gotten him in the 11th round. So there are people who on their fantasy rosters this season drafted Christian McCaffrey and Raheem Mostert and have started both probably since around week 2 of the season. Right. So this is that's why Mostert maybe has more of an MVP chance, because you didn't have to spend the draft capital that you spent on another running back who maybe fizzled out. Give it like a Nick Chubb, or, you know, Saquon's been pretty good, but he hasn't been like that dominant RB1 all season. He's certainly starting to round into form with that, by the way, another plug for the Giants. Yeah. But like Mostert's been an RB1 basically wire to wire, and you could have got him in the 11th round. Same thing goes for Puka Nacua, who was not drafted, period, until Kupp was placed on IR right before week 1. And he literally stepped right into the Cooper Kupp role of the offense. And then Cooper Kupp comes back. And guess what? Puka Nacua still producing at a fringe wide receiver 1 level, even with the wide receiver 1 the last time he played a full season. Don't forget that when you guys go into your drafts in 2024. The last time Cooper Kupp started all of the 17 games for his team, he was the wide receiver 1 going away. So something to keep in mind. I'm not necessarily afraid of drafting him early next year, but Puka Nacua, who I'm talking about now, he's going to be really interesting in drafts next year because of how consistent he's been. He was a waiver wire pickup from week 1, and you could have started him from week 1 to week 15, and Puka Nacua probably got you into the playoffs. So those are the two ideologies that are kind of going back and forth in the Wagenblast family group chat right now. Is like, I'm saying like you had to hit on one of the two guys in round 1, because that kind of informs what you do in rounds 2, 3, and 4, in my opinion. Most of the time is what you get with your first pick. And like if you took McCaffrey in round 1, you probably could have loaded up on receivers in rounds 2 and 3. And if you have McCaffrey and let's say like a Keenan Allen in the second round and DJ Moore in the third, your team's probably looking at a 1 seed right now, right? But on the other hand, like you could have taken, like I said, Christian McCaffrey and Raheem Mostert, and your team's probably undefeated. You know,
right.
So
yeah,
so it's a very difficult question to answer. For me personally, it's McCaffrey because you know you could have got him at pick 2 and felt like you got away with murder because like nobody should have drafted him, and like that's going to be kind of the mindset right now that I'm going into drafts with next year is like if you think Christian McCaffrey can play every game for the Niners like he's done so far this year, you kind of have to take him pick 1 just because of how many touchdowns he's going to score. He scored a touchdown in I think all but 1 game he's played
basically
with the San Francisco 49ers, which is nuts to think about. And he's under contract with them until the end of next year. So it's McCaffrey for me. There are a lot of options though, because you know, there's also been a lot of like nominees for disappointment of the year this year too.
That's fact. So I think my alignment with you is I'm sorry, I should say this. My thought on this is more aligned with you than Scott. So I think, especially because I kind of, told you what I wanted to talk about, most valuable player should almost be like pick a side, right? And then I was going to ask you about the most valuable pick, which is where you go with the Mosterts and then Kuiz, maybe a Keenan Allen or something like that. But I think when you talk about most valuable player in fantasy football, obviously, if we're talking about a draft league with a budget versus a snake, that whole thing gets thrown out up into a blender anyway, right? So most valuable player, you got to almost throw that value out for the pick and just say, what has the player done? And to that point, it's got to be McCaffrey or Hill. So I'm in agreement with you there. So let's move on into let's just go right now. You know what? You kind of just touched on the most valuable pick, if you will, unless you have someone else who's in that unsung hero category that you want to talk about. Someone maybe not waiver wire Puka Nacua pickup, but maybe someone in rounds 3 through 10 or whatever it may be for you that stands out. That's an unsung hero for you this fantasy season.
So one of the trends that I noticed this year in fantasy football is I think we were a year too early on some guys in terms of like giving them the crown. But I also think we were a year too early to throw dirt on the grave of some players who are certainly towards the end of closer to the end of the career than they are the beginning. But like the perfect example, and this is what Scott and I have been talking about in our conversations around fantasy football all regular season, is like Christian Watson and Jerry Jeudy and Devontae Smith were all being drafted ahead of Keenan Allen and Mike Evans this year. Maybe not Keenan Allen so much, especially in PPR leagues, but like Mike Evans was regularly going in the 8th and 9th round and is now like a top 10 wide receiver. He just locked up his 10th straight season of 1,000 yards. Like this, all the guy does is score touchdowns. And like, all you had to do was hope Baker Mayfield could be a league average quarterback. That's exactly what he's been. The only reason the Bucs aren't running away with the NFC South is because their defense has taken a huge step back. So Mike Evans has really been, I think, one of the more valuable picks that you could have had. Adam Thielen early on in the season looked like he could be another one of those guys where it was just like, oh my God, like, of course somebody had to step up and catch a ton of balls from Bryce Young. And Thielen's really good in the middle of the field. He's really good on check down routes. He's really good at freestyling. And that's exactly what Bryce Young needed, because that Carolina offensive line in pass protection looks like Swiss cheese holding up a gated fence. And it's just been horrible to watch. So Adam Thielen kind of comes to mind with that as well. I'm trying to think. Kyron Williams, obviously has been huge. He was more of a waiver wire pickup, though. I don't think he was really being drafted so much. So at the running back position, it's really just Mostert at this point. Brian Robinson is another name. He's been, but like, that's kind of the point with like why I think it's kind of been a down year for the NFL. Like, has Brian Robinson really stuck out as somebody who's played really, really well this year? I don't think so. And he's a top 10 running back in all formats right now because he scores a lot of touchdowns and someone on the Commanders has to.
The Rachaad White in a PPR setting, obviously Rachaad White, he kind of stands out, but you're right. There's not a ton of standout running backs. It's more along the lines of like, oh, I took a decent level flyer on Pacheco in rounds, well, I don't know, whether it be like 4, 5, 6, and he's been extremely solid. I love that I have Pacheco on my team, right? That's been the crux of the running back position this year, outside of a Kyron Williams, kind of like you mentioned, who, just burst onto the storm when he was healthy. Yeah. He was elite. But there's not that guy this season who has really just like, holy smokes. Like when Kenneth Walker bursts on the scene and he's popping off monster run after monster run, you're like, yo, this guy's crazy. Yeah. I can't wait to own him in every year for the rest of my life. And then he's obviously got injuries and et cetera. That guy doesn't really exist this year outside of Kyren Williams. I agree with you.
That's one of the things, because you had mentioned maybe some waiver wire guys to keep an eye on. Like the championship winning waiver wire pickup is not there right now. They have not presented themselves. Unless like you get super lucky and Trey McBride, the tight end for the Arizona Cardinals, basically the reason they cut Zach Ertz, is still out there, which I don't think he would be at this point. He's had back-to-back weeks where he's a top 5 tight end. So, and he's drawing Travis Kelce, he's drawing Travis Kelce comparisons on X, formerly known as Twitter. There's only one Travis Kelce, as some certain highlights from the Chiefs-Bills game will indicate. So let's maybe not be too quick to anoint him as the next greatest tight end in league history. But correct. But yeah, it's really been about who stayed healthy the longest in this fantasy football season. We haven't really gotten a guy who's come back from injury, and maybe Jonathan Taylor will be that, but he was also getting drafted in the 5th and 6th round because we knew that he was probably going to come back after 4 weeks. Unfortunate news about the thumb surgery. I do have one quick note on Pacheco that I don't think enough people are talking about, by the way. He was playing well against Green Bay, got ejected from the game towards the end, and then popped up and missed last game on the shoulder injury. How has no one connected the dots that Isaiah Pacheco might have thrown out his shoulder throwing a punch in the middle of a game? Because I find that hilarious.
That is interesting. I did see on Twitter that this is the second time he's gotten the scope on the shoulder.
Okay.
So maybe
I thought, because I haven't even seen a replay of him falling awkwardly or anything. I was like, he swung too hard on a punch. Just popped up.
It was like on a Thursday, and the Chiefs reporter was like, Pacheco's not here today. It was like, where is he? And then it was like, he's out.
Typically a great sign to not be in the building on the Thursday practice. Yeah.
But he was getting a quick little scope of the shoulder or whatever it was.
Right.
So yeah, I agree. But Pacheco's been awesome to have.
He's great.
He's the type of guy.
I love him. Rutgers, New Jersey.
He's a backbone guy.
Yes.
And I think other guys who I think deserve a shout out, and not because they are unsung heroes. I want to call this category, Dom. I just thought of this off the fly, but I know you're a fantasy guy who's going to be able to think on your feet here. What about a guilty pleasure for you? And that's a guy who may not be a top 4 round pick, but somebody in those middle 8 rounds who was on your bench a couple times. Maybe you plugged and played him at the right time, and now you're hitting the playoffs, and you're like, all right, this guy's he's been there for me. I trust him. Do I trust him more than maybe one of my top 4 round picks who's been a little bit iffy or a little bit banged up, et cetera? Is there a guilty pleasure guy out there for you? If you want me to go first, I can.
I can go first. It's Jaylen Warren, the RB1A for the Pittsburgh Steelers. It's so clear how much more talented he is athletically than Najee Harris. And, Najee Harris is a little bit more of a quarterback's best friend out of the running back position. And so, Warren's kind of playing time, especially now that the Steelers, they might make the playoffs, but I think we can both agree, they're not a threat. So I've really enjoyed him. I ended up just starting him. One guy who was kind of on my radar for this right now is Ty Chandler from the Minnesota Vikings, who in his sparing use has looked has popped off the tape way more than Alexander Madison has, who got the kiss of death on collectionsblog.com because he was part of my 5 players my fantasy season will depend on. Who are those 5 players, you might ask? They would be Justin Herbert, Garrett Wilson, Michael Thomas, Alexander Madison, and I believe it was Raheem Mostert. So a nice hearty 1 for 5 on that. So, David Montgomery was the other one who has been good but missed time.
He's been good.
He's the only one I hit on out of all. I guess Herbert too, but yeah, every time I make that list, I'm like, all right, all 5 of these guys are going to suck. So KOD. So I apologize, and then people will reach out and be like, you did it again. And I was like, I know, I didn't mean to. Trust me.
At this point, it's impressive.
Trust me, if I had known that, putting Garrett Wilson on that list would have torn Aaron Rodgers' Achilles. And yes, he tore it. Can we cut that out too, by the way?
Yeah.
Another guilty pleasure guy that I've really enjoyed, Odell is starting to look closer and closer to himself, which is awesome. I spot started him in a couple of places. And it's just fun to go to the Taysom Hills of the world. I don't think Taysom Hill should be allowed to be on anybody's fantasy team for longer than 2 weeks. He should just be
illegal.
Yeah, he's like the sisterhood of the traveling pants for fantasy football tight ends. Everybody,
he should actually get automatically dropped every week.
Yeah, I think that's
automatic drop.
There's no way that we can't like set up an AI program to do that. You know,
Right?
it's just like, all right, well, I had Taysom this week, so I can't have him for another 2 weeks. But, you know, in week 5, I can claim him again. You know, something like that. Make it fun.
Let me give you a guilty pleasure for me here.
Yeah, let's hear
it. Based off my league that I'm just looking at the list here, he's a wide receiver 2, bottom end of the wide receiver 2, but he was a guy who got drafted anywhere between, let's say, 6 and 9 probably. Yeah. Cortland Sutton.
Oh my God.
Has been so sneaky consistent this year. And yes, it's been a little bit touchdown dependent, but I have a league, for example, here where he was probably the 4th or 5th receiver that I took.
Yep.
And I've just been ripping him in flexes week after week after week. And my guy just puts up mid-teens. Like, he hasn't done one game where he's gone for 28 fantasy points, 32 fantasy points, 140 yards, 2 touchdowns. But my God, in a PPR league, it's 17, 16, 15, 11, 10, 9, whatever. Like, he's just very consistent. And now I'm entering the playoffs, and he's the type of guy where it's like, he's been good to me.
Yeah.
He's been good. Like, every time I kind of call his number, he's not disappointing me. He's never been the reason that I'm coming up short. And Cortland Sutton, to me, very much under the radar in draft season because you didn't know what was going to happen in Denver. And if you had him on your team, hopefully you pushed his button sometimes. But him and even Zay Flowers to go to the Baltimore Ravens there, who had some more hype, but still drafted in that same kind of span there. It was hard to push their buttons early, especially if you drafted a bunch of receivers before them.
Right.
But my God, it's been super awesome to just have them and push their buttons consistently.
Yeah. I mean, Zay Flowers, I think, is the perfect sentiment because, he's had weeks where he's struggled, but like you feel like you can't bench him because the Ravens love finding new and inventive ways to get him the ball. And when he pops, and he's going to be really fun to have for a long time. Like, if you have Zay Flowers on your team in a keeper league, I don't know that there's a better option on your team. Obviously, like, send your screenshots. I'm at Why So Serious on Twitter. I'd love to kind of get into that discussion throughout the offseason because it's going to be a long one. But, like Zay Flowers has been really interesting, and he's kind of been the only super dependable rookie wide receiver, which is like not something that we're necessarily used to. By this time last year, like Garrett Wilson was looking really good despite bad quarterback play. Chris Olave had established himself essentially as a Saints wide receiver number 1. And, there's been a lot of receivers who have come in and made a difference towards the end of their rookie season. Right now, based on the class that we're seeing right now, and certainly, as a Chargers fan, I have to disqualify Quentin Johnston from this. It seems like Zay Flowers is that impact rookie wide receiver who can potentially swing some things for you in the playoffs, similar to the aforementioned Odell Beckham Jr. and, more recently, Amon-Ra St. Brown 2 years ago, just went on that crazy run, catching 10 passes and scoring 2 touchdowns a game for 3 weeks. So I'm very interested to see what Zay Flowers does in the next 3 weeks.
It feels like he could have one of those runs now as the Ravens try to separate themselves, and he can be, one of those dudes who's just like, oh my God, another game of 9 catches, 110 yards and a touchdown. Oh my God, another one, right?
Yeah.
Like, he really feels like that guy. Let's talk about some disappointments. Someone else, and these don't have to be top round. You kind of ran through a lot of the top round disappointments already, but just some guys who or not just you, but people that you thought, had some potential this year, were exciting mid-round players who just haven't shown up this year. Anyone stand out in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, so I'm not counting anybody who got hurt. I don't like to do that. It's fluky. It's very like, it's not something that I want to do when thinking about this category, especially because there are candidates who have played in nearly every single game. Austin Eckler did miss a couple games. He's been abysmal. And especially for a guy who was, likely the 2nd or 3rd running back taken in a lot of leagues this year, just hasn't lived up to that hype. A lot of things going wrong with the Chargers, obviously. I don't mean to keep bringing them up. I know they're my favorite team. I'm not trying to seem as biased as I am, but, it's been a big part of that story.
That's a fair one.
Yeah. At the quarterback position, like Josh Allen's cash, which has been good. Mahomes is still top 5 despite how brutal it's looked. So a lot of these early round quarterbacks have kind of lived up to their hype. Justin Herbert as well prior to his injury. There I go, bringing up the Chargers again. Devontae Smith getting drafted as early as he did ended up being not the best idea. There were spots where if you went running back heavy, he was your wide receiver 1. That didn't quite end up working out as well. I was a big just take Garrett Wilson in the 2nd round and figure it out guy this year. And a lot of that obviously was tied to the fact that Aaron Rodgers, popped his Achilles on the 4th snap of the Jets So that one's not really on Garrett Wilson. He's shown flashes of just how talented he still is, even in that same game where Rodgers got hurt. So, there's names that pop up all over the place. And that's kind of the point, is like, it's been a very up and down fantasy season. Like, even, like, again, outside of like Tyreek Hill and Christian McCaffrey, there really hasn't been people who've been wire to wire great all season. I've been really pleased with DJ Moore and his performance. He's wide receiver 6 and half PPR right now, but you got to remember there was that Thursday night game where I think he played the Panthers and he had 45 points.
40.
And he was awesome. And he's been awesome since Fields came back from his thumb injury as well. So I'm not trying to discount anything, but it's just been, the whole season's really been disappointing for me. So it's tough to pick like which players have kind of fizzled out that weren't injuries. You know what I mean?
Right. Because even Garrett Wilson and Devontae Smith, if you look at most of the rankings, like, it's not like they fell off the map and they sucked all year. They just, for where they were drafted, were just not as successful as you wanted them to be. They weren't carriers like you wanted them to be. And most of the other guys were just injured, right? Like maybe Dameon Pierce is a guy who just never got going. Yeah. And then he got injured.
He got hurt a little bit.
He was bad before that anyway. Jerry Jeudy, another guy who's another mid-round receiver people keep getting excited about, just couldn't get going.
But he'll pop up with signs of life. He scored this week,
That's true. Even Drake London had a huge game this week, but
he's had some monster. He's quietly had some monster games, and that was the one thing I was going to say was like this Falcons offense, man. Like, as long as Arthur Smith is the coach, I really don't know how you're going to be able to figure out who to trust on a week-to-week basis. Like, Kyle Pitts scored this week. He tied his career high for touchdown catches in a season at 2. Guy's been in the league for 4 years. He's supposed to be this like genre-changing tight end. Like, we're going to change the way we look at fantasy football tight end at the tight end position because of Kyle Pitts. Like, no, he's just another sacrificial lamb to Kelsey for who's going to put in another, he's like Kelsey's going to put in another year. You could argue he's been a disappointment this year because the gulf between tight end 1, Kelsey, and tight end 2, which is TJ Hawkinson right now, but Sam Laporta even and George Kittle are all 3 of them right there with Kelsey. Like, it just hasn't been, that year that I think a lot of people were expecting. And I think a lot of that has to do with just like poor quarterback play, injuries to the quarterback position. And, it's just been a weird year overall. And so, I could go on and on, really. Like,
yeah. Well, we'll go into some stuff.
Terry McLaurin, actually. That's the name.
There you go.
It's really him. I'm sorry it took me that long to figure it out, but like 5th round pick, he's been awful. And like Sam Howell like leads the league in passing yards, and like you'd never know it looking at Terry McLaurin's stat lines.
And Curtis Samuel's been better than him. Yeah. It's just like and Curtis Samuel's so inconsistent enough you're never going to play him unless you're on a crazy bye week or a crazy injury. So, if you're playing Curtis Samuel, you're probably not in a good spot, right? But he's been better than Terry McLaurin, right? And people probably play Terry McLaurin every single week for the first 6 weeks because you have to. Right. So I agree. I think Deontay Johnson, he got banged up, but he hasn't been there. Pickens, all the Steelers guys, really outside of the running backs, have been disappointing for the most part. They've had their splashes here and there, but they've been disappointing. All right, let's move on to talk about some strategy going into the final weeks and into the playoffs. Hopefully people listening are in the playoffs. So hopefully you guys had good fantasy years and you're still listening with some intrigue as you have some big decisions to make.
Yeah.
But I'll say this too quickly. Just like Monday night was the perfect example. We've seen a lot of horrible, great football this year. It's been ugly, hasn't been fun to watch actually the gameplay, but then you're having fun because they're close. Yeah. And there's a difference between good football that's close and bad football that's close.
Right.
But football's king, so we don't care. And we all gamble and we all play fantasy. It is what it is. But let's talk about the strategy now for the playoffs, because I think this is where things get really iffy. Some people are big, let it ride guys, and some people do overthink stuff, and sometimes that works out to their favor. So from an overarching strategy standpoint, when you get to the playoffs, Donald, how do you look at your rosters? Do you think of them as I have to ride the guys who got me here, or I got to think of this as a brand new season and start making tough decisions?
So the one idea that I wanted to make sure that I said when thinking about fantasy football in the playoffs, and this is something that we talked about a lot on Ruts as well, is, and I've literally wrote it down on this notebook here. It's don't fall into the trap of thinking that your decisions are going to get tougher in the playoffs. They should be easier.
Oh,
right. Because think about it. We're now 14 weeks into the NFL season. So you have 14 weeks worth of game data to look at with your players. Chances are, who the people who got you there are. So for example, like CeeDee Lamb is a guy in one of my leagues who's just been a stalwart for me in my lineup. He's going against the Eagles or the Bills this week. They're tough against the run, or whoever the Cowboys are playing. I think it is the Bills.
It's the Bills, yeah.
And so what am I going to bench CeeDee Lamb? Am I going to bench James Cook, who's gone back-to-back 20-point weeks against teams that are good against the running back? No. Like, you've got to trust that these teams know who they are at this point, and the teams that are executing properly are likely the teams that are getting you through the playoffs. So, the decisions should be easier. Now, that being said, there may be some times where you're like, you want to get that spark in, right? For example, one of my leagues, I have a pretty loaded team. So my running backs in that league are David Montgomery, Raheem Mostert, and Joe Mixon, who have all three been scoring touchdowns at a pretty good clip. So that leaves two positions for wide receiver. I have Tyreek Hill, second in command for fantasy MVP, and I've been starting Mike Evans every single week this year because he scores a ton of touchdowns. He's got Baker Mayfield's eye in the red zone. That didn't work out this week, and I benched Rashee Rice and Brandon Ayuk for Mike Evans. So now, yes, I'm rethinking it, and yes, it's going to be really tough for me to pick who's going to do that. Am I going to drop one of those running backs, maybe David Montgomery, if the Lions aren't going to be playing from ahead as much as they used to be in the earlier part of this season? So the counter to that is, okay, if you're gonna make your move, that's fine, but you got to understand that you're living with the consequences here, right? Like, what did Mike Evans do at the end of last year? I don't know if you remember this from week 17, Mike Evans. He had 200 yards and 3 touchdowns. Okay? And it ended up getting him the 1,000 yards that he needed. And that's the closest he's ever come to not getting 1,000 yards in a season. He absolutely needed every bit of those 200 plus yards that he had, right? So are you really going to bench that for a guy who's the best receiver on the Chiefs, which means next to nothing at this point? That's fine if you're going to do it, but you got to understand, okay, you're starting a rookie on an offense that's been very inconsistent, especially in wide receiver production, although I think it's pretty safe to say Rashee Rice has become the alpha in that wide receiver room in Kansas City. But does that equate to benching Mike Evans, who's, in the top 10 wide receivers wire to wire this season? I don't necessarily think that it does. At the same time, I have Brandon Ayuk in that league too. I don't even know if either of them should be started over Brandon Ayuk, who's now scored a touchdown in 5 straight weeks. Even with Deebo Samuel going thermonuclear over these last 3 weeks, Ayuk is still playing really well. And they're 12 and 13 in half PPR wide receiver rankings right now. So, it's a very tough thing. You're going to have difficult decisions. I'm not going to say that everything's going to be easy, but you are the person who got yourself into this position. Trust your gut and understand that sometimes you're going to make the wrong call. I had Isaiah Likely slotted in a tight end position. And, just thinking Denver's bad against the tight end. The Chargers need this win really bad. I know I'm bringing up the Chargers again. I swear to God, I'm not doing this on purpose. But I dropped Isaiah Likely for Gerald Everett 15 minutes before kickoff. And I almost lost because of it. Quite frankly, I deserve to lose because of it. I won. So it didn't sting as bad, but you're going to make those decisions and you just got to hope that everything turns out. But, don't let the fact that there's potentially bragging rights or in states that sports gambling is legal, money on the line. Don't let that fact that you're this close start to make you rethink the decisions that got you here in the first place. Trust your gut, go for it. Listen, I'm not going to stop you if you just lost Justin Herbert for the season, if you want to start Tommy DeVito. I'm not going to do it, but you got to understand that if you're doing this and Jordan Love is out there, who's probably got a higher floor in terms of fantasy points per week than Tommy DeVito does right now, that's on you. And as long as you can live with that, as long as you're, still having fun, which is at the end of the day what this should be all about anyway. As long as you're having fun with it, go for it. If you want to take the big swing, take the big swing. I'm trying to minimize risk at this point in the year. And so, even if I if I bench Rashee Rice for Mike Evans and Rashee Rice has his coming out party this week, okay, fine. I just didn't start him this week. Maybe next week I will. Depends on who the Chiefs play. You got to take it week by week, and these situations are going to evolve.
Because I think people get nervous, especially when we're such a recency bias based, fan base here, where it's oh, so and so did better the last 2 weeks, but this guy has been way better for 14 weeks. What do I do? And I think Brandon Ayuk's the perfect example because you look at his game log and it's just double digits every single week. He's had his pop off games, he's had some big numbers. He's gone in in full PPR, he's only gone under 10 twice. I'm sure in half PPR, maybe 3 or 4 times. But nonetheless, it's like, how can you justify for yourself? It's almost like, what would you rather lose by? Going with Ayuk or going with Rashee Rice? And I think that is like kind of the perfect example there. But I think there are some other situations where it is a little bit trickier. So I want to throw some things at you here and see what you think about it. So I'm going to start off with quarterback, because I think that's one where it is really easy to kind of overthink stuff, and you could start thinking about a guy and say, oh, he's really had a couple bad games in a row now, but he is a QB1. So how about a guy like Trevor Lawrence or Tua Tagovailoa, who have had some iffy weeks? Obviously, Trevor has a little bit of an injury situation going on as well. Would you consider going with a Baker Mayfield or a Matt Stafford or someone you can get off the wire, like Desmond Ridder just put up 25? Or do you just roll with Tua, who has been, in theory, or Trevor Lawrence, been your starter for 14 weeks now?
I'm going to try to get to every name that you just said. And I'll start with the one that sticks out the most.
Sorry.
With everything that we just said about the Falcons offense, you can throw Desmond Ridder into that as well, in that you don't know who's going to perform on that Falcons offense on a week-to-week basis. They're too malleable. That's kind of the point. That's what Arthur Smith wants to do. I wouldn't trust Desmond Ridder. I mean, I trust Desmond Ridder with, like, helping me out around the house. He's not going to be the guy I stake my claim on a fantasy football championship for. I just won't do it. And you mentioned another great name alongside him, like Matthew Stafford, who is looking better and better. He's healthy. He's Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, both fully healthy, ready to go at this point. It looks like they gave Baltimore all they could handle. I don't have the schedule in front of me. The Rams have a really good matchup this week, and it would be a really good time for Stafford to just kind of start
Washington.
Yeah. Like, why not? If you're iffy on quarterback and Stafford's out there, I'm not stopping you from doing it. The one thing I will say is, like, Baker Mayfield, you got your Russell Wilsons, and I know it's really trendy because the Broncos are now, quote unquote, one game out from the Chiefs in the standings. Like, the Chiefs get to play the Chargers again without Justin Herbert, and I think they also have to play the Raiders again, who couldn't score a point on the Minnesota Vikings last week. So, like, the Chiefs probably are going to be fine in the West. But, like, as good as like the Buccaneers looked and as good as the Broncos have looked over the last, like, month and a half, Russell Wilson in their season changing run that they've been on has not gone over 20 fantasy points. So if you want to if you want to go safe, fine. At quarterback, I'm looking for the guy who's most likely to get me 20. Out of that pool, it's Stafford, it's Jordan Love, it's those are the guys. And I'm still not entirely sold on Jake Browning, but man, it would be fun if he went on a run this year. So if you think that he's for real, if you've crunched the film on the Bengals over the last 2 weeks where Jake Browning got wins over the Colts and Jaguars, maybe they just played the AFC South, which is, not that great of a division this year, at the right time. I don't know. Like, I think this Browning kid's pretty good. I don't know that he's Tommy DeVito, but he's looking pretty good right now. So, like I said, if I'm going to make a change of quarterback, it's because I think that guy has the chance to get 20 points more than the guy I'm starting does. Tua's still got Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, and if the Dolphins have to go a full week knowing that Tyreek Hill is not going to be available, their offense is going to look a lot better than it did when Tyreek Hill was off the field against the Titans this week. Right. And who knows? Like, he might play. So I'm not even ruling out Tyreek Hill at this point. But the one thing I will say about Tua, it's looked a little bit like this in December too, as we reach the end of the Dolphins season. Like, their offense just didn't look as crisp as it did early in the year, and that's going to start to matter at some point, both in the narrative, in the playoff chances. Like, obviously they lost at home to the Titans. I think they have a pretty good get right spot this week where they play the Jets.
They have the Jets.
So, I mean,
it's home though.
They got the Jets and then they got the Ravens. So, if they slip up against the Jets, that Ravens-Dolphins game all of a sudden looks really, really scary. So it'll be interesting to see what we get out of the Dolphins. I'm not ready to jump ship on Tua, especially if Tyreek Hill is okay to go this week. I haven't seen practice reports yet. We're recording this on Tuesday, so the first practice reports of relevance are going to be released today. So you got to just keep an eye on what Tyreek Hill's doing. For Trevor Lawrence, he's been fine in fantasy, right? He still threw 3 touchdowns. Yes, he turned the ball over a bunch, but in a lot of leagues, you're only losing 1 point for an interception. So he threw, rather than throwing 3 touchdowns, he threw 2.25 touchdowns. So I'm not necessarily too worried about it. Their offense does seem to be moving the ball very well. They're just losing these games, which, we talked about potential fraud alerts on some of these quarterbacks. Like Trevor Lawrence just lost to Joe Flacco and Jake Browning in back-to-back weeks. That doesn't seem so great.
Who's counting?
I am, because I'm sick of a certain quarterback being accused of being a fraud when, other people maybe aren't getting the same criticism. That's all. I've also I've always kind of just been we're just anointing Trevor Lawrence. And granted, he was unbelievable at Clemson and could not have been put into a worse situation his rookie year. So I am happy to see that he's kind of started to regain that hype that was around him. But at the same time, he's year 3 too, and it's not necessarily like a slam dunk that he's going to be challenging Burrow or Allen or Mahomes anytime soon. So just a thought.
And I think the Tua thing is probably the most interesting. Same with Jordan Love. I feel like those are the two guys who, if they've been your guy for a while now, Jordan Love probably not the entire year, but for a good stretch now, you are nervous. I'll just be honest. I have Tua in a league right now. I haven't held a backup quarterback because I don't hold backup quarterbacks typically.
Well done,
and
sir.
I'm like, I know what I'm doing a little bit around here.
Very proud.
So but now I'm like, I need a backup quarterback because things are getting a little hairy over here. And I ought to be honest, I'm looking at my waiver wire and I'm seeing Matt Stafford on it right now. And I'm going, well, goddamn, I'm probably going to go and put the rest of my fab on this guy and make sure I have a quarterback that I think will get me 15 points where, God forbid, Tyreek is out. You got to have a plan B. Because if he's out against the Jets, I can't go into a playoff matchup playing Tua. And that's just what it is. I think the same thing for Jordan Love right now. Granted, they have the Buccaneers this week, which should be a better matchup, but you could have said that about the Giants too.
Yeah.
So who's to say, really?
One more thing on Tua, because they were in the red zone. I think they were on the 9-yard line or something, and their backup center botched a snap, and because of that, Tua lost a fumble. If that is just turned into, a touchdown pass to Durham Smythe, we're probably not even having this discussion about whether or not we can trust Tua,
right? Because
then it's 7-0, and or whatever the score would have been at that time, and it could have been a completely different game. And obviously, ifs and buts, are not necessarily what we should be thinking about right now, because in the end, he did look not so great after losing Tyreek Hill and his center in the same game. But with a week to prepare with new faces in different places, maybe we get a different Tua. That being said, like you said, Stafford, everything's in place, a really positive matchup. If you don't have to commit to a full replacement of Tua for Stafford for the rest of the season, this week it might just be a better matchup for him, and that's fine too. That's kind of the risk that we're running. And this is a good time to kind of have a backup quarterback. I have in the leagues that I had, a quarterback who got hurt. Luckily I was able to kind of go up and pick up Jordan Love, because I was like, oh, my quarterback got hurt on Sunday. Lawrence doesn't look as good as I thought. I better pick up Jordan Love now, since he hasn't played yet, and I could drop somebody on my bench for free, and I don't have to use fab on him later. So, it's all you'll have to keep your eyes open. But for the people who are in the playoffs, if you just go with the people who got you there, I don't think anybody could possibly fault you for trusting the guys who put you in to the playoffs in the first place. So you don't have to overthink it if you don't want to. I'm somebody who will typically just let myself overthink it sometimes. So go for it. But you don't have to.
All right, let me hit you with a couple more rapid fire here. Right. Running back, guy who I find interesting, who definitely has helped people get to the point if they're in the playoffs right now. DeAndre Swift was just a monster guy who you got for great value. Maybe you picked him up off the wire after week 1. He's been great, except for the last 3 weeks. He's been pretty disappointing. The Eagles have been disappointing. Is that a guy who you may have played all year, who now you're second guessing yourself and saying DeAndre Swift, maybe not in my lineup right now?
I don't think so. He's a talented running back. It's not necessarily that he is playing bad. The entire Philadelphia Eagles team has not looked good. And going back to our discussion before of I think if you have a good quarterback, a good coach, and a good GM, your team is going to be set up for the future. We know the Eagles have the quarterback, and we know that the Eagles have the coach. I think Sirianni, he had my vote for coach of the year until things got a little muddy over the last few weeks. And now it's going to be kind of difficult to not give it to either Harbaugh or McCarthy. And, we'll see what happens with the MVP. But, the Eagles are going to figure this out. They had their 2 toughest games on their entire schedule in back-to-back weeks, and their defense is just not playing well enough right now. I think they have it in them to get it figured out. And again, like Giants, 2 out of the last 3 weeks, and in between their 2 Giants games, they play Arizona. They play a reeling Seattle team on Monday night. I doubt they're going to come out and look flat on 2 straight primetime games. I just don't think that this Philly
3
team
straight, basically.
Yeah, right. Because the Niners Eagles game was like the only good 4:00 game 2 weeks ago. So you're right with that. So like they're not gonna. Yeah, I just don't believe that this Eagles team can come out flat. And so this is part where I'll go down on my shield. Like if I had Swift, he got me there, and he's their best running back. Period. So you're gonna roll with them, and you may fail with them, but like I'd rather he score 8 points half PP or full PPR in my starting lineup than score 25 on my bench and I lose. So
yeah, I couldn't agree more, especially if you're going with someone who maybe just had one good week recently, and that's what you gotta have to just hold your nose a little bit. It's kind of like when you bet that underdog.
Because who else is there, right? Did you get Keaton Mitchell? Right. Are you really that sold on Keaton Mitchell right now? He's for as good as he looked, he still hasn't scored a touchdown for the Ravens. And I happen to think Keaton Mitchell could be a league winner because he is electric with the football in his hands. And I think the Ravens are really starting to see and trust that they can give him the ball more and more. You can see it. Gus Edwards had 5 carries last week, and like when they want to throw the ball to a running back, they still have Justice Hill on their team. So like, but like I'm not starting Swift over Keaton Mitchell if I have both right now. I'm probably trying to find a way to start both. But if I have to pick one, it's going to be Swift. It's going to be the guy who has looked really good on 2 different teams and really good for most of this season. Like the Eagles are just not playing very well right now. They're going to figure it out. And if that happens, that's going to mean that Swift is going to play well.
Are you ready to play a Tajay Spears over a DeAndre Swift because he's looked 2 weeks in a row?
Absolutely not. Tajay Spears will not touch the ball inside the 10-yard line when the Titans get there. And if you watched the game last night, like they really started to figure some things out with that offense. Was some of it just Will Levis yeeting deep balls to DeAndre Hopkins? Yes, but that's kind of the whole point with DeAndre Hopkins. That's what he's been his whole career. He's made household names out of garbage quarterbacks because of how good he is. And by the way, he was a free agent for 2 months, and the Chiefs were like, we're good.
Yeah,
that's the most mind-blowing part of the NFL season to me was that like OBJ and DeAndre Hopkins were free agents for 2 months or longer, and at no point did the Chiefs look at their wide receiver room and be like, we could use one of these guys. They had the money.
Yeah.
They had the money to do it. It's nuts.
Straight up blew
nuts.
It. And it made no sense when the Titans went out to get him because we're like, what are the Titans even trying to do here? Well, they're trying to compete. That's what they're trying to do. All right, let me ask you some extremely selfish questions because they're exactly who the guys I have on my team. But I do have a conundrum. Okay. I think this is a real conundrum. So take this for what it's worth. I'm in a 2 flex league, 12-team league, full point PPR, and I have a plethora of wide receivers and 3 running backs to play. Okay. All right. And I'm not trying to brag. I'm being honest. This is my best team of the year. And I just don't know what to do, Don. And I think there's some people who might find some similar situations. So here are my running backs. I have Saquon Barkley, Tony Pollard, and Isaiah Pacheco. All right. You think in 2 flex league, all 3 of those guys are probably in there, right? Well, hold on. Keenan Allen, Brandon Ayuk, Cortland Sutton, Zay Flowers, Cooper Kupp, and Puka Nacua. I don't know what to do, man. I don't know who to sit. And last week I sat both Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, which feels like blasphemy. But Cortland Sutton and Zay Flowers combined for 35 points. So I wasn't exactly disappointed, right? So if this were you, if you had this type of situation and maybe someone's in a similar situation with a 1 flex league, so it's not quite the same thing. If you're looking at Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua and you almost feel torn that you have them on the same team, or you're looking at Keenan Allen now without a quarterback, but he's been a wagon this year. Where do you make that decision? Where do you go? And maybe selfishly with those specific players, where do you go?
So, you have the 2 obvious, I think, guys who can fall out, right? You got Pacheco, who's coming off a shoulder injury. He's a small runner. He's a between the tackles runner. He's gonna be put in harm's way a lot. I also think the Chiefs still think that they're going to be fine, so they may end up resting him another week, and that's fine too. The Chargers' season is over. They have no run in them. Easton Stick, God bless you, buddy. Go make yourself some money in these next 4 games Maybe you can get yourself one of those high-end starter spots, like a Taylor Heineke level contract, or what Jarrett Stidham has with the Broncos that they didn't end up using for him at all this year, right? So, and Keenan Allen has not practiced yet, and they play Thursday night, and the Chargers just lost their quarterback. It would not shock me if Keenan Allen sits down this week. It would not shock me at all. So that might make your decision a lot easier because it takes Allen out of the equation. Sure.
Which sucks for all Keenan Allen owners, by the way, because he's been phenomenal this year.
What level? What PPR is this? I'm sorry to make you repeat yourself.
Full PPR.
All right. You can't sit Kupp in full PPR, especially when he's healthy and Stafford's healthy. I don't think you can sit Ayuk right now, and obviously you're starting Saquon and Pollard. So I think that's two running backs, 2 wide receivers, and I think I have 2 flexes left.
Yeah,
I like Zay Flowers and Puka Nacua over Keenan Allen,
and Cortland Sutton.
Oh, I knew I missed a receiver.
I threw a lot at you there, so you're doing great.
I tried my best. I knew I missed a receiver though. So, this is, I mean, kudos to you for putting this team together. This is fantastic. But this is where,
and you know what?
This is where it comes out, right? This is what I was just saying. Like, hey, listen, like you've put yourself into the playoffs with this team. You've navigated these difficult lineup decisions. Trust yourself that you're going to be able to do it again. You know, like.
Yeah,
Cortland Sutton. You can argue against yourself until lineups have to set at 1 p.m. on Sunday. I get that.
Like, is it a stupid way to look at it that Cortland Sutton has scored, let's see, every single week but 3 times this year?
Not at all.
He scored every single week. So does that mean he's due for a not touchdown, or is that he's just going to keep scoring? Because you could argue till you're blue in the face.
As a big subscriber of the he's due movement, especially when guys haven't scored a touchdown in a long time, Stephon Diggs this week is a guy I really like for that thought process. But like at the end of the day, like Sutton not only did this with Russell Wilson, like he did it a couple of years back when they had like Case Keenum and Brock Osweiler and Paxton Lynch at quarterback, and it was awful. But Sutton still found a way to have 10 plus touchdowns. This is his second season in the last like 4 or 5 where he's had 10 plus touchdowns. Quietly, not a lot of receivers can say that, right? Like, I don't even think Travis Kelce can say that he's had 2 10 plus touchdown seasons in the last 5 years. So, and he's the greatest tight end of all time. So, there is something to this connection and the trust that Russell Wilson has in Cortland Sutton and just his ability to make contested catches. So, with Sutton specifically, like you have a guy who's going to get chances to score touchdowns. And in half point PPR, like that's monstrous. In full point PPR, it kind of goes away because like you can't really bench a guy like Cooper Kupp, who's a candidate to get 10 catches every single time he steps on the field with Matthew Stafford. That also makes Puka Nacua a tough sit, but you never really like it's always weird seeing that you're starting 2 guys who play the same position on the same team in fantasy. And so if this were my lineup, and this is all, I'm not saying you should do this. I'm just saying you've given me the names. This is who I'd start. I would go Saquon, Tony Pollard, Ayuk, Flowers, Kupp, and Cortland Sutton. I would leave Nacua off. I would leave Keenan Allen off. Give it a week to see what Easton Stick looks like. It's not like you're going to be terribly like if Keenan Allen catches 8 passes for 79 yards, scores 17 full PPR points. Like you can get that from Zay Flowers. It's going to sting if Keenan Allen plays Thursday night and he's like, and you're like, damn, like I could have banked 17 points or an easy one.
Yeah.
Obviously, if he scores 2 touchdowns, you're gonna be beside yourself, right? So that's another thing you got to think about because Keenan Allen does have a 2 touchdown game in his back pocket already this season, and they have no one else.
No one else.
I mean,
and the reason I know obviously we're at the point of the podcast where people are probably like, all right, dude, I don't give a shit about your super specific lineup questions. But with the Keenan Allen question, we talked about don't bench your studs, go with the guys who got you there. He's kind of the loophole in that argument there where it's like, oh, maybe you actually can't go with the guy who's been your most valuable pick of this season. So all right, Don, I don't know if you have anything else to add. It's been phenomenal. Chopping it up. Let me hear it.
Defenses, like your defensive matchups, don't worry about it if they're facing good offenses. Like the Cowboys defense is playing too well right now. You got to play them. I played them against the Eagles last week. How'd that work out for me? Pretty good. Double digits against arguably the best offense in the entire league. like the Browns defense seems to be matchup proof. The 49ers defense seems to be matchup proof. Like you don't sit those defenses right now. They're playing too well. They've established themselves. You got to just roll with it. You're not going to want to cut them and then have, you certainly like the Eagles defense. I know they're not playing very well. Like Giants, Cardinals, Eagles, or sorry, Giants, Cardinals, Giants for the last 3 weeks of the season. That's tough to argue against, because like, what are the Cardinals going to be doing in week 16 or 17 that I know? So the other thing too is I think we're at a very, I think we just need to acknowledge perhaps the changing of the guard in two different positions, the tight end position and the kicker position. I think we're noticing a changing of the guard here. I think you have to go into next season with Brandon Aubrey at the top of the kicker list.
Monster. And
which means that for the first time in like 11 years, it's not Justin Tucker. And that's crazy.
It's crazy.
The other and Aubrey's got a huge leg. He obviously hasn't missed a kick this year. That's not going to stay the same. If it's anything like the last couple of years for the Cowboys in the playoffs, his first miss of the year is going to be a game-winning field goal attempt. Like, just prepare yourself for that, Cowboys fans. I'm sorry, I can't see the future. I can just predict it. But like the other thing, and this is always the thing you got to keep in mind when you're talking fantasy football kickers. And I know nobody wants to do this, so that's why I'm ending with the Kelsey discussion. Like, Dallas plays indoors, so you're going to get 8 or 9 out of the 17 games that the Cowboys play indoors with a guy who became the first kicker to hit 2 field goals at 59 yards or longer in the same game. Like, Brandon Aubrey is your kicker 1 going into next year. Don't keep him. I'm not saying that, but like, when I think about when I think about those like forgotten gems, like Brandon Aubrey's one of them. He was an absolute like he was a game wrecker. If you're in a league that still has kickers, and as we move along and the years are moving along, like there's a big swing to ditch kickers. I'm not necessarily on that fence. I do think it's a huge part of the game, especially if you're in a league that allows points per yard in field goals. So like a 19-yard field goal is 1.9 rather than the full 3. So just something to think about. And then the other thing with Kelsey is like, he's slowed down this year, period. And maybe it's his age, but maybe it's something else. I have no doubt in my mind that he is going to propose to Taylor Swift if they're still dating by the end of the NFL season. And if she says yes, and this is stupid, this is a bit, obviously, I don't care, right? Like, but like if they're engaged, Travis Kelce does not need another cent for the rest of his life if he marries Taylor Swift. He doesn't need it now.
There's got to be a prenup in that situation.
So, but like I am saying, like there will be a case.
They're high on the divorce wire.
Oh my God! I mean, forget it. That's the last thing the world needs is Taylor Swift going through a divorce and the Swifties. God damn it, they're so annoying.
Oh my God.
Anyway, bit over, because I do actually think that like T.J. Hawkinson and Sam Laporta, and to a much lesser extent George Kittle, have a claim at the number 1 tight end going into next year. Because Kelsey's not so far clear of them that they can't pass him this year. Sam Laporta, 23 years old, in one of the best offenses in the league. And, the Sam Laporta thing has been real since week 1. He had a lot of targets that he didn't turn into a ton of yards against the Chiefs in that first game, but he's gotten better and better. And, like, you're not going to be able to get him late. And he's been awesome this year. So I do think that I do think that we might see some Sam Laporta tight end 1 as a draft, because I don't think Kelsey's going to be that slam dunk first round pick like he's been the last couple of years going into next year.
Yeah. And Hawkinson could actually end this year with more points than Travis Kelce.
Now, Kelce he's right there right now.
So the average is higher for Kelce still, but Hawkinson's right knocking at the door. I look forward to it. Hopefully we come away with some championships before we get into next year's fantasy draft. But what a time. What a time to be a sports fan. I'm hoping everyone listening here has at least one team in the playoffs where they're still holding out some hope. And if you have CJ Stroud, it goes without saying, pick up a quarterback just in case you don't have one. He might be out of concussion. He might have a concussion. We'll see.
That did not look great. That did not look great.
CJ
Stroud has looked great, but man, that was, that fabled MetLife turf, man. It's claimed a lot of us.
All right, Don. This has been glorious.
Thank you.
We shot for 30. We went for an hour and 5, and I wouldn't have asked for it.
I do
way.
apologize for that. This is obviously it's been such a huge part of my life for the last 10 years. So any chance I get to talk about it, I appreciate, especially when I get to do it with you, Pete. This is definitely the last recorded conversation you and I are going to have before the holiday season. So whatever you and your family are celebrating, have a happy one of it. I hope to get you back on the Collections Pod at some point once we really dive into the NBA season a little bit, because I know the Knicks have been a lot of fun so far this year. So I'm sure you've been riding the roller coaster of that. And to the Subway Sports Talk listeners, collectionsblog.com, Collections Podcast on Spotify. We'd love to have you. And thank you so much for listening. Anytime, like I said, I know I said this at the end of the last episode, Pete, but if you light that beam, I will answer it, and
yes,
so let's ride, and best of luck to everybody. Try to enjoy it. I know it's going to be stressful. I am already not super thrilled about my plans this weekend, because I don't know that I'll be in front of a TV for most of it, but just try to enjoy it when you can. And it's just chaos. That's all it is chaos. So hopefully we can find some calm in it as well.
And something we should have mentioned, don't forget that there are games on Saturday.
Oh God, yeah.
Set your freaking lineups on tomorrow.
If you have a guy playing on Saturday,
if you
have a guy playing on Saturday that you're going to start, make sure that they're in your running back or wide receiver or tight end position. Don't put them in your flex. If you have a late second injury that you have to swap out for, it's a lot easier to replace a flex than it is a strict running back, wide receiver, or tight end.
It's the little things, Don. Yep. You don't miss. And that's a key. That's how you know who the real fantasy players are. When all of a sudden, why is Christian McCaffrey in flex? It's because he's playing on Monday night, and you had to have the flexibility. Just God forbid.
Yep. That's right.
See, that's why we get you here, Donald. We appreciate you very much. Collections Podcast on Spotify. Don, hopefully we'll talk to you soon. Happy holidays to you and yours.
Thank you.
As well.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.